Okay, our next speaker then is Suzi Kerr. Suzi, do you run Moto?
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
Just research.
Just research. And she's going to continue, I guess, with this hassle of forests and greenhouse emissions and so on.
Absolutely. So it's a nice continuity from the previous talk, I think. There's increasing empirical evidence and qualitative evidence coming out that offset systems, and particularly avoided deforestation, but also more generally CDM, lead to very few actual additional reductions. Estimates of 75% being spurious and not leading to any change, up to about 90% in the Costa Rican payments for ecosystem services market. Almost compelling evidence that these markets really aren't working as currently designed. So given that huge amounts of effort, money, talk are going into REDD, and that deforestation is a real issue, both for climate change and other reasons, what I'm doing with my co-author Arthur Van Bentham, who's a PhD student at Stanford, is trying to look at how you can improve the design of these policies to make them more effective. So, you all know all the motivation stories about deforestation being bad for biodiversity. This is a real problem if we have serious deforestation. So the motivation, more seriously, is that avoiding deforestation is apparently very low cost. Whenever people do studies of this, it looks like an incredibly cheap mitigation option. But the models assume that policy is efficient and that people are being given an accurate incentive at the landowner level where they can make a change and there are no transactions costs and all of these sort of things. But in reality, deforestation policy in particular is incredibly inefficient. So if we can't put liabilities on the people who deforest, which would be a fairly efficient way of doing it, just have a regime that says you have to pay when you deforest, which coincidentally is what we do in New Zealand, then how can we improve policy? So this is the challenge. So we're designing policy under some constraints. And the constraints are that we're thinking about contracts where we're paying for avoided deforestation. We're not able to coerce or force people to avoid the deforestation, and it's voluntary participation by the developing countries. The key policy criteria that we're analysing are efficiency. Do we end up with the land going to the efficient use? Are we saving the right pieces of forest? The offset quality, what fraction of the offsets that are generated are spurious or not spurious? And value for the industrialised countries who are actually buying these credits. So what's the average cost they pay for real reductions, not for the offset itself, but for the actual reductions that are involved? The model that we use, this is a theoretical paper, is that we have a continuum of plots of forested land, and on each of those plots there is a return RI if they cleared that land. And so that's the return for agriculture that they could get in the future, timber revenues, net of clearing costs, but it could also include any other sort of psychological barriers, other amenity values, etc. associated with that, because this is theory, so we don't have to measure it. PC is a payment to maintain forest, so it's the price of carbon that's associated with that. So the simple model is that you will clear if your return from clearing is greater than the price of carbon, and that's what we would like people to do. And we've got an environmental externality from deforestation from the point of view of the industrialised country. This is how much they're willing to pay to avoid deforestation, and that's equal to delta. So the simplest policy would simply be to go and set the price of carbon equal to delta and pay everybody for keeping their forest and pay for the storage that's implicit in the forest. If you did that, you would get everybody who has a positive return, who would want to deforest without the payment, so their return from clearing is positive, but their return from clearing is less than the price of carbon, so that the private benefit is less than the public benefit from avoiding the deforestation, you would save all of those pieces of land. So it's an incredibly efficient policy. And the disadvantage is that it's incredibly expensive, because you're not only paying for the pieces of land where they would have deforested and you're saving them, you're paying for all of the pieces of land. So this is why people end up in this voluntary space. So trying to reward relative to a baseline. And the simple idea is that you have a baseline in our plot level, you have a baseline of 1 if it would have been forested next period anyway, in which case you don't have to provide any reward to keep it in forest, or 0 if it wouldn't be forest. The problem is we don't know what the these baselines are. People talk about measuring baselines. You cannot measure a baseline because if you have the policy, the baseline didn't happen. And we are incredibly bad at predicting where deforestation is going to occur, which means we're incredibly bad at predicting baselines. And so people, I think, underestimate this problem very seriously. What you're really rewarding relative to is this very noisy measure of a baseline, which hopefully has some correlation with the true baseline. So you're measuring relative to R hat, which has this error on it. And that creates the problem of adverse selection, which I think is what's driving the devastating losses of additionality in things like CEA. So the efficiency loss there's an efficiency loss from deforestation, because what you really want to have is that everybody has a return between 0 and PC, responds to your policy, and saves their forest, and you get a gain. But some of these people whose returns are between 0 and PC will have an error that is so big in their baseline that the regulator will say, oh no, you would have kept your forest, there's no way you're going to deforest, we're not making a payment to you. And therefore they'll deforest even though they shouldn't have. So you can look at this in a simple picture. So for somebody who was never, who was going to definitely clear their forest, their baseline level of forest is 0, there's a possibility that they are above PC, so the return from clearing is above the price of carbon, in which case they're not affected by the policy. They're going to clear whether or not the policy exists regardless of their baseline. But in the zone from 0 to PC, they shouldn't deforest. They should participate in the program and get the return and not deforest, but they may well get an assigned baseline of 1, in which case they're not eligible for the program. So you're going to have an efficiency loss. You're also going to you're also going to get losses. I'm sorry, I've just been talking about something else and I'm having trouble getting into deforestation space. So let's look at the average cost to an industrialized country. When an industrialized country goes into Indonesia and buys a credit, they pay for the real reductions that they actually achieve, so they pay the price PC, but they are also paying for the spurious offsets. So the price per real offset is PC, and then plus this OS, which is the spurious offsets, divided by the actual amount of avoided deforestation. And relative to a pure subsidy, the number of offsets that are spurious, the amount that you're paying for forests that would have stayed anywhere, falls a lot. So the average cost of the program to you falls a lot, but the avoided deforestation also falls because you had that efficiency loss. Some people who should have participated won't participate anymore. So the average cost probably falls relative to a pure subsidy, but it's not absolutely clear that it does. It's not ambiguous. It's not unambiguous. So you have this problem of efficiency on that side. On this side, you have the problem that there will be people who would never have deforested their land because the returns to clearing are too low. They still won't deforest their land, so there's no efficiency cost here, but they're going to get some credits for nothing, and that's the problem where you're going to get offset quality being very low. So what are the solutions to this problem? One solution is scale, and this is the only solution that is actually unambiguous, that definitely leads to improvement. And this is why a lot of the argument about RED is getting away from these individual projects, small-scale projects, and going up to the level of Brazil or Indonesia. You also avoid a lot of the leakage at that level if you can do that. So the way that it works is that in our model is that you are aggregating plots. So you're just adding all the plots together and you create one continuous baseline, which is a fractional baseline for all the plots rather than having single plots. And then the participation decision is different now because you're not participating plot by plot, but you look at the return that you'll get from the whole group if it goes in relative to the cost of going in. So the cost is that you'll have to forego all these returns that you would have got. And the benefit is that you get these prices on the units where you have a baseline that says that you would have deforested. Some plots with unfavourable baselines will now be included because they'll be grouped into a set of plots, some which have favourable baselines and some of which have unfavourable baselines. And that means that the offset quality on average is going to go up. There is some risk, however, and this is very visible in the political process, that some groups will now inefficiently opt out. They would have come in if you dealt with them project by project, but when you try to deal with the whole of Brazil, maybe you push too hard, you try to get too stringent a baseline, and the whole of Brazil opts out. And so we've had potentially these massive efficiency losses. As the number of plots go to infinity, if these are just unbiased errors, then your baseline is going to get more and more accurate. So the average error is going to go down and down and down until you've got close to a very perfect system. So in the limit, with unbiased errors, but lots of errors, then the program is going to be efficient. And this whole trade-off between efficiency and transfers potentially goes away. Of course, in the limit, there still will be some bias involved in those estimates. We did some simulations with some sort of reasonable looking scenarios. This is not real data, this is just simulations. Looking at what happens to efficiency gain when you've got errors in measurement of about 30%. So you're getting your returns estimates about 30% wrong, standard error of about 30%. And quite rapidly, what you see is that as the size of the project goes up, so instead of dealing with one plot, you're dealing with a much larger plot, the efficiency gain goes up very quickly, and by 100 in our model, you've got up to a completely efficient system. This doesn't tell you what 100 is, but it's saying that essentially increasing scale can have really quite dramatic effects on the efficiency of the system. It also has dramatic effects on the fraction of spurious credits, because essentially all the errors that you're making begin to cancel each other out, and you get rid of this problem altogether. So by the time you've got 100, only 100 independent projects joined together, you've basically got no spurious offsets at all. You still have the bias issue. The second solution is that you would make the baselines more stringent. What this does is it potentially reduces efficiency, because some landowners are going to opt out. Some landowners are going to have a baseline that's too strong and they would efficiently enter into the program and get the reward, but now they're going to opt out because you make a mistake in the wrong direction. It does improve the quality of offsets, because by making the baseline more stringent, you're definitely removing some people from getting offsets when they weren't changing their behaviour. And it lowers the average cost to the industrialised countries, because they're not paying for nearly as many of these spurious offsets. The third solution, sorry, that shouldn't be up there, is discounting. And this is one that's very popular in the policy world. So discounting reduces efficiency and avoided deforestation. Discounting is where instead of paying the full value of the credit, you pay some proportion of it. So maybe you pay 10% less or 20% less. Or in the extreme case of some of the US programs, you actually only get 20% of the value of the credit, because there's a sort of 5-to-1 trading ratio. So this seems attractive, because if you've got 20% spurious offsets, why not just pay 20% less and then your problem's gone away? Well, the problem is when you pay 20% less, the people who respond to the program change. So if you're getting spurious offsets for doing nothing, and now you're being paid 20% less to do nothing, well, you'll still do nothing, and you'll still claim your credits. So changing the price has no effect on the spurious offsets, but it does affect the behaviour of the people who are responding to the price, because now there will be a whole mass of people whose returns were quite close to the price of carbon, but aren't above the discounted price of carbon, and those people are now no longer going to respond. So it lowers the quality of offsets, I've already said that. The number of spurious offsets doesn't depend on the price, so discounting doesn't deal with the offset spurious problem at all. It generally does lower the average cost though. If you can discount and only pay 80% for all your credits, you're paying 80% on all the inframarginal ones as well as the marginal ones, and it makes it much, much cheaper for industrialised countries. So it's possible that part of the subconscious, at least motivation for these discounting, is that it's a great way of negotiating a better deal with developing countries. Trading ratios are one way in which this discounting is brought into being. They are more likely to protect the environment, because every time you buy an offset, or every time you want to offset 1 tonne of carbon, you have to buy 5 tonnes of credits. You will end up with low quality offsets, but you may well end up with more total reductions just because you're buying so many offsets.